Hi there, Mai, and welcome everyone. Come on in and join us for our World Water Day webinar. Hi everyone, come on in. We're just going to get things started now. Kia ora everyone. Hi there, Mai. We're just getting things started right now. Sorry for the delay. Kat, do you want to get things started and kick off our little video to start off our webinar?
What's the biggest thing we can do to save water?
Can you make urine drinkable?
How much water do we need to survive for a day?
What the earth is groundwater?
Can you make salt water drinkable?
Now, those are all great questions, and we're going to get things started to ask these questions. So, kia ora koutou, and welcome to our special Ask an Expert session on World Water Day. World Water Day is held on the 22nd of March every year since 1993 to celebrate water and raise awareness of the 2 billion people living around the world without access to safe water. The theme for this year's World Water Day is groundwater, making the invisible visible. Groundwater is the largest source of fresh water on Earth, but because it's stored beneath the surface, it's often overlooked. And now I'm going to introduce our expert, Katy Grant. Katy is a hydrogeologist with 16 years experience working in New Zealand, Australia, and the United Kingdom. She graduated from Cambridge University with a geology degree and then Birmingham University with a master's degree in hydrogeology. She specialises in groundwater and aquifer assessments and provides expertise into projects for mining, energy, construction and government projects. She loves getting out into the field to drill and test boreholes and undertake monitoring of water levels and streams. And if you, like me, really don't know what all of that means, then you're in the right place to find out. Now we're just going to get to a bit of housekeeping, and I'm going to introduce you to our wonderful panelists. We've got Millie, wave for us, Millie. Fox, thanks Fox, and Manali. And these guys are going to be asking the questions of Katy today on your behalf. So if you've got any questions, pop them into the Q&A down the bottom of your screen or into the chat, and we can get those answered for you along the way. But in the meantime, Millie, Fox and Manali have put together some great questions to get us started. So I'm going to start with Millie. Millie, do you want to come off mute for us and ask your first question of Katy?
What is groundwater, and are the creatures in the ground under the water?
Hi Millie, that's a great question. As I think you're all aware, groundwater is quite hard to imagine because you can't really see it. It's quite difficult, but the easiest way to think about it is if you think about at the beach, you see a load of sand, and sometimes if you're near the water, you dig a hole and water just fills that hole, just comes from nowhere, and it's seeping out from between all the bits of sand and gravel. And that's basically what groundwater is, but rather than at the beach, it's just under the ground, almost everywhere. Often in New Zealand, we've got quite gravelly deposits down in Canterbury, and then there can be quite a lot. In other places, it's just in little fractures in the rock, and there's not very much there. So yeah, it is everywhere, but it's very hard to imagine. But yeah, basically, if you just think about stones with water around them, that's pretty much what it is. The question about creatures is really interesting because it's actually something we've only discovered recently. The picture here actually shows some from Australia. But we do have these in New Zealand as well. And it's only really been in the last 10 years that we've realized they're even there. And they are like tiny little shrimp and tiny snails and some very odd looking creatures. And they're actually, they're in all groundwater, but we don't know much about them. So they're very different in different places and they can react to different water quality. And really it's all new, so we're all still looking and learning about these at the moment, so definitely still a lot to learn about them, but they're pretty hard to see.
That's such a cool question. Thanks, Millie. Fox, have you got a question for us next?
Yes, I do. Do we drink or use underground water in New Zealand?
Yes, Fox, we do. Not everywhere. Some places use river water, but a lot of places the public water supply is from bores in the ground. Or even some farms, you might have a spring on a farm. That water is coming from groundwater. That's just where it comes out at the surface. So in Wellington, which is where I live, we have reservoirs which store surface water from the river, but we also have a bore field in the Hutt Valley, and that takes water from underground, and that comes out of our taps. That's what we drink. They treat it first. So it depends where you live, but a lot of New Zealand does use groundwater, yes.
Cool question. Manali, have you got one?
Yes, I have. How old is the groundwater?
That is an interesting question, Manelli, and it is very variable. So in some places, if you're sort of near a big river, the water in the ground might be quite young. It might be less than a year old, or, you know, five years old maybe. If you are taking water from a very deep aquifer, which happens quite a lot, say up near Tauranga or Nelson, they also take from quite deep aquifers, that water can be very old, and it's sometimes quite hard to work out how old it is. There's lots of ways of doing that. They use isotopes. Now, it's not my field of expertise, I have to say, but it's very interesting work, and they can give you an idea of how old the groundwater is. In New Zealand, our groundwater probably ranges from very young to, 100 to 200 years old. But in some parts of the world, it can be even older.
Wow, that's awesome. Katie, I've got a question from, well, it looks like there might be a question coming in from Liana. Liana, you've got your hand up, and I'm going to allow you to talk so that you can ask your question.
Okay, my question is, do not waste water.
That's right, Liana. We don't really want to waste water because whilst it looks like there's a lot of water particularly in New Zealand, and I think Auckland saw quite a lot of water yesterday, actually a lot of that just runs off into the sea or is in the rivers, and we can't use it. It's not necessarily easy to use. So again, Auckland will be very aware of this, of the recent droughts. We actually have to try and save our water. In New Zealand, we're quite lucky, but in some parts of the world, there's really not a lot of water available at all. They have to be very careful with how much they use. There's lots of simple ways we can do that. Having a shower instead of a bath, not watering the garden when it's just rained. Simple things like that can actually save a lot of water if everyone does it at the same time. And we should all try and save it in these little ways. I'm not saying don't drink as much as you need, because obviously we all need water to, drink and wash, but just think about how you use it a little bit.
That's such important advice, Katie. Thank you. Millie, you've got a question. Millie, you'll need to come off mute.
Does groundwater get polluted?
Yes, Millie, unfortunately it can. It's not as easy to imagine as surface water when you can easily imagine a barrel of oil pouring into a river. But if that oil or another pollutant spills on the ground, it can slowly go down through the soil, through the little gaps and cracks, and end up on the groundwater. And then it can contaminate it there. And then it can travel very slowly through the ground to where we might be taking it out through a bore to drink. So all water supplies have to be quite carefully monitored to check this doesn't happen, and that we won't be affected. But also we have to be quite careful about how we treat the land. So sometimes we might not even know, but we have to be careful with where we discharge our wastewater, where our sewage goes, so that it doesn't come into water that we want to drink. So the difficulty with pollution once it's in the groundwater is it's quite hard to get out, because it's trapped in all these tiny, tiny little holes. And sometimes it can be quite deep. So we can't just dig it out and move it somewhere else or treat it. So it can actually be quite difficult. So pollution is a big issue. We're fairly lucky in New Zealand that we've got quite clean groundwater in a lot of places, but it's something we need to maintain and look after.
Fantastic. Fox, do you have another question there for us? Do you want to take yourself off mute, bud?
Understanding water is very important, but why is science?
Well, I think, I would definitely believe understanding water is very important. That's what I do for my job, and it's what I really enjoy. But I mean, all science ties in not only to water, but to how we live. So I'm going to stick with water because that's what I know. But there's a whole load of different science that goes into understanding groundwater and surface water. There's engineering about how to design dams and things like that. There's biology, looking at the different plants and organisms and how they affect those sort of things. There's understanding how farms work and how they might impact on the water. So, I mean, almost everything we do has science involved in it in some way or another. And it's great to understand. You don't need to know it to the finest detail. Just having a general knowledge of how things work makes life more interesting and makes it easier for us to live in the world.
Thanks so much, Katie. Before we get on to Manali's next question, I've got a question from some of our attendees, and one from Linley. Does groundwater dry up in a drought?
That's a really good question, Lily, and it really depends where you are and the aquifer. Some small, shallow aquifers, so that might be near rivers, can definitely dry up in droughts. And the problem in droughts is not only that the groundwater might dry up, but we're much more reliant on it. So if there's loads of water in a river, then we don't need groundwater as much. But if we're in a drought and that river's getting, really dry, then we need to look for water elsewhere. And that's when we might use groundwater more. And then obviously we're using it more. So we're taking more out, but we're not putting the same amount back in, and the aquifer levels tend to drop. So it might not dry out entirely, but there'd just be a lot less available. So there might still be a bit in the bottom, but you not have the amount you can actually extract. So we do have to watch groundwater in droughts. There are lots of different ways we try and control that, but the main one is making sure we don't take too much water out in those circumstances.
Thanks so much, Katie. Manali, have you got another question for us?
Yes. Where does water in our bath taps come from, and how do children in villages without taps and taps get their water?
Great question, Manelli. So as I said earlier, it kind of depends where we are as to where the water from our bath taps come, but it also depends on the time of year. But in New Zealand, it tends to come from rivers and from the groundwater, so from water bores. And it's usually treated and then goes through a series of pipes and then comes out of our taps, and we can just turn it on and off when we like. There's a lot of management behind that to make sure that we can, but for most of us, it's something we don't have to worry about. But in large parts of the world, that's not the case. There might be a stream that doesn't run all the time, that people have to go with buckets to get water from, or they might run a small pipe from that stream, and then they have to be very careful that they don't use too much. There might be a bore, but it might not be connected up to any pipes. So again, they might have to go out with buckets and then pump the bore to get water and carry it back, and have to be quite careful with how they use water. And one of the most interesting things I've read is that actually, once we have an easy supply of water, we very quickly start to waste it. So when people have to carry water for miles to get it, they're very, very careful. You know, they use it for drinking and cooking and just a little bit of washing. They're very careful with it. But as soon as we have it on tap, it's easy. You know, leave the tap running while we brushed our teeth, or, forget to turn off the hose, and we get wasteful. And that's what we need to be a bit careful with and try not to do so much, and think about how hard it might be to get water if that wasn't there.
Thanks so much, Katie. We've got a couple of other well, one isn't a question, it's an insight from a 4-year-old Sophie, who says that she'd like to be a scientist like you one day, Katie. So that's pretty cool.
That's a great idea, Sophie. I massively think you should be brilliant in science, and the more people who enjoy it from a young age, the better.
It's great. And another question to add around groundwater is groundwater from the pipes safe to drink?
Yes, in New Zealand, they do a lot of testing to check that it's safe. So if you're on a public water supply, so basically if you live in a town, and you can turn on your tap and the water comes out, then the water supply is safe. They test it and they treat it as well. So often the water in the ground is clean, but it then goes through a whole load of pipes to get to you. And that might be where it can get polluted potentially. So they treat it to make sure that can't happen, and they check the pipe networks to make sure that the risk is really minimal. So unless there's a warning, your water coming out of your taps is safe to drink. If you have your own bore, then usually that's fine too, and you would test that. Sometimes actually rainwater tanks and things like that, because possums can get into them and things that can actually be less safe and need to be checked a bit more regularly. But in New Zealand, we're quite fortunate that the water is usually quite good. Where I was talking about earlier with the places that don't have public water supply, if you just have a bore or a well maybe in a town, sorry, this is my cat, and cattle and things are moving around the bore, and they're all, doing their cow pats and doing their peas. This is stuff you don't want next to your water supply. This is where that can give you stomach upsets and things like that. But luckily in New Zealand, we're pretty safe from that kind of thing.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katie. Millie, have you got another question there?
What happens to water on the land after tsunami?
Thanks, Millie. I think that's really interesting. And I've got this picture here, and I know it looks a bit complicated, but the bit that's really interesting is that white area is just fresh water. That's what we might drink. And then the blue is salt water, which we can't drink. And then the sort of pink shows the tidal wave, the tsunami coming across, and that puts salt water on top of the land. And then some of that salt water is the red bit, can seep down into the fresh water. Now, if you, a lot of people who live around the coast will have bores into that shallow groundwater, and that's what they use to drink or to irrigate their gardens. And if that gets contaminated with salt water, then they can't drink that. So along with all the other damage that might have happened from the tsunami, like their houses getting knocked over. They might not be able to get any fresh water. They might have to go somewhere else to find it. And even if they have a public supply, if that's in the same water, then it can be contaminated as well as potentially being damaged. So water supply can be a big problem following a tsunami for coastal communities. And it's something that has to be dealt with quickly. There's also long-term impacts in that salt is then in the soil and water, so it can then rain, and it can make the groundwater quality less good in the long term as well.
Katy, is there any way of making salt water drinkable?
Yes, there is. They do it quite a lot in Australia, and I know Qatar as well. Most of their cities over there are purely on desalination plants. So I actually did some work in Qatar, so I know a bit about that. And their groundwater is very salty, and there's not very much of it because it doesn't rain very much because it's a desert. So they just take water from the sea, and then they use a very expensive machine to take the water out. And basically it uses a lot of energy to almost basically boil the good water off and leave all the salt from the sea behind. And that gives them their fresh water. You can do it with wastewater in different ways. They use reverse osmosis in Australia for sort of not so much seawater, but water that's a bit salty. A lot of their water there, because it's so hot, is not as good quality as we have in New Zealand because we get a lot more rain. So they have to treat it to make it drinkable. And yeah, there are methods we can. We don't tend to in New Zealand because we don't need to, because we do have good freshwater supplies if we manage them properly.
That's a good, that leads on to another question that's come through from the floor. And one is, how much water does New Zealand have?
I have to say, I honestly couldn't tell you the answer to that question. It has a lot. We get a good amount of rain. We have probably more water than we can use, but it's not all where we can use it. So I'm sure if you're aware, if you live on the West Coast, there's been a lot of rain come through there in the last year or two. But most of that just runs straight off into the ocean. We can't use it, you know, it's too quick and it's too much in a short time. Other places have really quite dry summers. Nelson and Auckland often have very dry sort of summers. So whilst they have quite a lot of rain in the winter, and it's not a problem, it might not be enough to top up on some dry years. Other years it will be. So yeah, I honestly don't know how much water we have in New Zealand, but it does vary from place to place. So some places we have a lot, some places we don't have as much. And some places we have a lot, but we can't use it. So that's part of the problem with managing both surface and groundwater.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katy. We'll take two more questions, one from you, Fox, and one from Manali, and then a couple more questions from the floor, and then we'll wrap it up because I know everyone's time is important as always. So let's, Fox, do you want to choose any question that hasn't been asked yet that you'd like to ask?
What can we do to try to save water?
Well, Fox, I think the easiest thing to try and save water is just to think about it when you use it. So when you're brushing your teeth, you can turn the tap off. When you're just brushing away, you don't need to leave it running. When you're having a shower, you know, think about how long you're in the shower. Do you need to sing that extra song? When you're out, you know, doing your gardening and things like that, do you fill up a watering can if it's a dry summer day rather than just spraying the hose everywhere? How much do you need to wash your car in the summer? You know, ask your parents, oh, do we need to do that now? And then other things, which perhaps maybe more your parents, is just be aware of when local authorities say there's water restrictions, and try to follow them. So some places you can only irrigate, water your gardens on certain days, things like that. So just try and be aware of that kind of thing. And it's a lot of it's just thinking about how we use water. We're still going to need it. You're always going to need water. You can't cut it out, but just think about the best way to use it.
Great advice. Manali, what question would you like to ask for your last question?
How much water does a person need to survive each day?
Thanks, Merle. That's a great question. I think we might have a picture for that one that's just coming up. So I found this on the World Health Organization, and this gives us a good idea of how much we need and what for. So they sort of say about 10 litres of drinking water a day and 20 litres in total for drinking and cooking. And that's kind of, you would consider your basic survival stage would be about 20 litres of water per person per day. You can get by with less. I think people, if you can survive for 2 or 3 days without water if you have to, but it's not something any of us want to experience. But then, of course, water is not just for like a basic survival need. We use it for a lot of things, cooking and washing, keeping ourselves clean, getting rid of our waste. And while these things might not seem as important as drinking, actually long term are quite important. If you can't get rid of your waste effectively, it can make you sick and things like that. So they all need considered. As you can see here, they reckon up to about 70 litres a day to cover all your sort of basic needs, from washing, growing some vegetables, getting rid of your waste, and drinking and cooking. Now in New Zealand, we tend to use a lot more than that. So we probably about 230 litres a day per person on average across the country. That varies quite a lot from place to place, but obviously we're using perhaps more than might be considered the basic requirement. So there's definitely room for some saving there.
Thanks so much, Katy. I'm going to do one last question here, and then for some of you have asked questions and we haven't had a chance to answer them. So what we'll do is we'll put together those responses and send them to the email address that you registered for the webinar on, and so that everyone can have an opportunity to have their questions answered, because they're all great questions. But we are going to go with this last one. How do you know where to look for groundwater?
Yeah, and then that's basically what I do for my job. So what we do is initially we look at the rocks. So some rocks are going to have more water in them than others. So gravel is a great example of a rock that's likely to have water in it because there's big spaces between the gravels. Whereas if you go into the grey wacky, which makes up a lot of our mountains in New Zealand, that doesn't have, it has some fractures, but it's not so easy to find water in. Then we look for other sort of geological features. So faults, obviously we have lots in New Zealand, and faults are quite useful. And they can kind of give us information about where the water might be. And we look at aerial photos as well to see where there's lots of vegetation. That can always be a good indication of shallow groundwater. And just to look for other features that just indicate what might be there. And there's also lots of public records about old bores that have been dug by farmers and, you know, old landowners over the centuries, that we look at those to see what they say, whether they actually found anything. And then eventually we have to drill a hole to see if it's there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And it can be a bit of a dark art. Generally in New Zealand, we have a good idea of where the water will be a lot of the time. When I worked in Australia, that was not always the case, and we could drill quite a lot of holes and not find any water at all. And then you drill the next one, you'd hit a big crack in the rock, and then there's loads of water there. So that was a bit more hit and miss. But in New Zealand, we tend to target the gravels are where we tend to look the most because they have the best options.
How exciting is it when you drill and the water comes?
It's pretty good. The best is when you get a lot. So sometimes you'll drill and you know there's water there, but you don't know how much, and it will come out and it'll be a bit of a trickle, and you're like, oh, that's a bit disappointing. And then sometimes you'll drill and you'll get loads more than you think, and that's really fun and really exciting. And you're like, yeah, we've done well here, and we can have a look and see what happens. But yeah, it can be pretty interesting.
Do you get wet?
Sometimes. When we drill, we have to obviously take samples to see the water quality and to check the flow, and yeah, sometimes we get wet.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much everyone for coming along, and thank you particularly to Fox, Manali, Millie and Katy for joining us today. We've really enjoyed this webinar with you, Katy. And Fox, Manali and Millie, you've been amazing panelists and question askers. So thank you everyone for coming along. And as I said, if you didn't get your questions answered, we will send out those responses. We'll get Katy's insight into them and send those out. So thank you. Ka kite anō. Inohora, and we'll see you again next time. Bye, everyone. Bye.